Good morning. Good morning to those in the United States and in the Western Hemisphere, and good afternoon and good evening to those joining from around the world. My name is Franklin Kramer, and I'm a board member and a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion on integrating the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda framework with the United States national security and national defense strategies. This morning's discussion is organized by the Transatlantic Security Initiative of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and by our Secure Future. The Scowcroft Center works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its partners. We seek to honor the legacy of service of General Brent Scowcroft, his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, to support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and to dedicating, as he did, the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Our Secure Future was founded to strengthen the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, to build a more peaceful world through ensuring women's full participation in governance. The organization works to ensure the effective incorporation of gender perspectives into peace and security decision-making at both the national and the international levels, a result which leads to greater security for everyone. The discussion today is in the spirit of both organizations. In October 2000, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 1325, which reaffirmed the importance of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts and in peace building. The resolution stressed the importance of equal participation in all efforts for the maintenance and promotion of peace and security, including the need to increase women's role in decision-making. And the resolution recognized that women and children account for the vast majority of those adversely affected by armed conflict, including as refugees and internally displaced persons, and that they are increasingly targeted by combatants and by armed elements. In the United States, the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017 undertook to codify and provide a framework committing to the principles of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. And since then, more work has been done on the topic by both the prior and the current administrations in support of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. There is, however, a great deal more to do. The release of the U.S. national security and national defense strategies reflects that the United States and its partners are, and in the words of the strategies, entering a decisive decade. From the acute threat of Russia to the pacing threat posed by China, responding to modern challenges, to modern security requirements, requires an integrated approach. The Secretary of Defense, for example, has underscored the importance of integrated deterrence. And one key element of integration is the role that gender plays in foreign and defense policy to help the United States achieve its goals and to ensure collective security. That includes assuring inclusivity in our force and among our policymakers, for ourselves and also for our allies and partners. That includes assuring that a gender perspective is part of the development and implementation of strategy. That includes taking account of and responding to the disproportionate impact of conflict on women and children, as is now occurring in Ukraine. In short, incorporating the Women, Peace, and Security agenda in U.S. security policy and strategy is both a moral and a strategic imperative. And at the strategic level, incorporating this gender lens can ensure the United States, our allies and partners, are equipped to achieve the goals laid out in the National Security Strategy and in the National Defense Strategy. It can pave the way for effective operations on the ground. It ensures the equity of our force, and it leverages the best knowledge and talent the U.S. has to offer. There have been useful steps to those ends. And by way of example, NATO's new strategic concept includes the importance of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda across all of NATO's core tasks. But moving from concept to implementation will be key. And for the United States, as a leader in the transatlantic community, we need to ensure that we are setting the right example for how to incorporate a whole society approach to our defense as democracies. This is not only the right thing to do, but it will provide a strategic advantage against autocracies like Russia and China that do not share this outlook. I anticipate that today's discussion will underscore how to incorporate gender and security issues effectively within the national security and national defense strategies of the United States, and what might be done to operationalize the women, peace, and security agenda alongside U.S. allies and partners. Today's panelists each have enormous expertise and experience. The conversation will be moderated by Dr. Xanthi Sharf, who is the co-founder and CEO of the Fuller Project, an award-winning newsroom and communications team dedicated to catalyzing positive change for women. Dr. Sharf, over to you.
Thank you so much, Franklin, for that wonderful framing and gracious introduction. I am thrilled to be here with you all, our audience, to talk about the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, which has long roots, and to talk with three women who are both experts and have committed their work over the years to advance the inclusion of women in considerations of peace and security for national strategic advancement and for global strategic purpose. First, I will introduce Sahana Dharmapuri, who is the director of Our Secure Future, Ambassador Milan Verveer, who is the executive director of Georgetown's Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, and Dr. Kyle Ann Hunter, who joins us from RAND, where she is a senior political analyst. I'm going to start with a question to you, Sahana. So the title of today's panel has to do with strategic blind spots. We want to know, in the agenda for women, peace, and security, and including with the release of strategies in October for national security and national defense, what are those strategic blind spots?
That's a great question, Xanthi, and thank you so much for having the panel. Thanks for joining me with the other panelists too. The major strategic blind spot in the national security strategy, I feel, is the missing language about the importance of gender equality, and particularly our commitment to the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. We have a law that was passed in 2017 to advance women, peace, and security, and it is alluded to in relationship to the Global Fragility Act, but it is not a full-on commitment to women's participation, women's equal rights, advancing of gender equality as a national security interest for the United States. So I think that that is a disappointing omission in the strategy, despite the fact that we have legal commitments.
So Sahana, to break it down for our audience members, when the national security strategy is released and it doesn't have an overt commitment to the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, what does that mean in terms of your efforts to move forward future strategy, future resource commitments? How does that hurt those efforts to move forward, women being included in, thought of, understood as a strategic important issue related to national security?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think my colleagues here can also answer that very well. But from our perspective, it really does not allow for the people working on the issue to tie back their work directly to the strategic interests of the country. And so it basically creates an incoherence in policy and legal commitments to our democratic values. Because if we have a legal commitment and that actually requires Department of Defense, Department of State, USAID, Department of Homeland Security to have strategies, implementation, action plans, et cetera, on advancing women, peace, and security as the policy of the United States and a commitment to women and women's rights, but we don't have it in our national security strategy, it's difficult for people to tie their work back to that central priority. It becomes a non-issue or a siloed activity, and I think that's a real it is a real blind spot, and it does not help the United States in its advancing stability and security, or in its leadership, really.
Right. And to be clear, like you said, an act was passed, 2017 Women, Peace, and Security Act, followed by a strategy, followed by an implementation plan, and the agencies that you mentioned, those 4 agencies have taken actions against those plans, and so surprising now to see that this isn't mentioned in the national security strategy.
Yeah, it makes the commitment weaker, because I do want to say the national security strategy does talk about women, the protection of women, sexual gender-based violence. It does make a commitment to double the efforts of USAID on development issues, but what it doesn't do is talk about the agency of women and women in decision-making and women's role in advancing democratic freedoms and being gender equality as a strategic interest of the United States. And I think that the last thing I'll say about that is we know from decades of research and practice that the treatment of women by a state is a predictor of a state's behavior. Therefore, if women are treated better, if we really value gender equality in whatever state we're talking about, we see higher levels of peaceful activity, higher propensity of states to negotiate out of conflict versus pursuing violent means to address problems or challenges. And I think that should be considered a strategic interest of the United States if we want to create a more peaceful and stable world and international world order.
All right, thank you. So to be clear, we're hearing about policy today, we're hearing about research today, we're hearing about what happens on the ground. So you'll hear more of that from our panel as we move through. I want to come back for our audience. Ambassador Verveer, you more than anyone can tell us about the history of this agenda. Bring us through how this has developed over decades, and also give us this central answer: what is women, peace, and security?
Well, thank you, Zenti, and it's a pleasure, of course, to be at the Atlantic Council and to be here with Sahana and Kyle. The antecedents to this resolution, which came out of the UN Security Council, that part of the United Nations that grapples with peace and security issues, some 20 plus years ago now, the antecedents to that were what we were learning. Why was this forward-looking? Because it was based on what was going on. So we had the situation in Bosnia, the Balkan War, and the horrible things that were perpetrated against women that then led to so many other outcomes recognizing sexual violence and its weaponization, the International Criminal Court, and all of the work that went on in terms of human rights and what that represents. The situation in Rwanda, not only the horrible genocide in Northern Ireland, they brought issues to the table that their male counterparts did not. Issues, in some respect, had they been fully implemented to this day, Northern Ireland would be in a different place. Really critical issues. You had so many situations on the ground, South Africa and what was happening post-apartheid, and that transition and the critical role women played in building the democratic institutions and political participation. So that led to an understanding that we need to be more forward-looking. We need to be strategic. We need for this not to be a blind spot, but for it to be a strategically implemented understanding. And what was that understanding? That they were really predicated on 4 pillars. One, women are engaged in prevention. They're an early warning. Look at the state of women. What did our female engagement teams do in Afghanistan? They warned about what was happening in communities that could be a predictor for worse to come. And there's so many examples of this in counterterrorism, for example. So prevention. The second element was in terms of participation, the difference women can make at peace tables and what they're doing every day in terms of mediation on the ground at that grassroots level, taking those experiences, responding to situations. And there was what happens in the transitions. It doesn't end with a peace agreement. It begins in terms of trying to create sustainable peace. What does that take in terms of economic empowerment? What does it take in terms of political understandings, building democratic institutions? All of those elements which, if not addressed, the fighting is going to be renewed. And then there's the element of protection. What we were seeing is the weaponization of sexual violence as a weapon, as a tactic of the wars, and that protective element had to create an understanding that this was wrong, it was criminal, it not only needed to be survivor based in terms of what was needed, but also to be addressed so that it wasn't a situation of reigning impunity, but really perpetrators being held to the crimes that they had committed. And so what you see in those 4 pillars is agency of women, in fact, overriding understanding of agency, and you see protection. But women will tell you, if they were sitting here out of any conflict area, is don't look at us as victims. They are leaders and they have a critical role to play. They represent half the population of the world. And they belong in this conversation. They belong in strategic decision-making because, as we heard earlier, this isn't just the right thing to do. It is that. It is moral. It is based on values. It is based on human rights. But it is the smart thing to do if we really want to create a world of sustainable peace and security. And so that platform, that framework, that approach called the Women, Peace, and Security approach, based on the first resolution, which often in shorthand is referred to as 1325, because it was resolution 1325 coming out of the Security Council. But over these years, 9 more resolutions were adopted, 2 presented by the United States. So we've played a leadership role in this in terms of even our work at the United Nations, and continue to, even the absence in strategic security policy today. But the strengthening of that and the commitment of nations around the world, over 100 now, have national action plans, and the United States has a law, the first country in the world to have a law on this issue. And the question is, where's the implementation?
That's right. When I hear you talk about it, there is clearly a drumbeat that goes back, again, decades, with lots of important milestones along the way, including in more recent years, which I know, Sahana, you've been very active on, including working with and building a caucus around women, peace, and security at congressional level. So let's now take it to implementation, operations. Dr. Hunter, Kyle-Ann, eager to hear from you about this. So first of all, I know that I believe it was 1999 to 2011, you were a Super Cobra attack pilot serving multiple tours between Iraq and Afghanistan. And in your leadership on the ground, you've shared with me that you have observations that you were in situations where tactically, strategically, it was vital to have more participation from women.
Yeah, so thank you very much for this. And again, it's always an honor to be joined with such great colleagues here. And so when we think about what this actually means, implementation, right? When we talk about a lot of strategic concepts, they become very high level, right? We think about all these nice words, protection and participation and what that really means. And I really want to hone into this participation and agency side of it, because one of the things of whether or not we want to admit it, women always participate in conflicts. Since World War I, conflicts have been taking place inside societies. These aren't battlefields that are far removed where you have combatants that are just shooting at each other and then everybody goes along their daily lives, right? Conflict takes place in society. So even if women aren't seen as traditional combatants, women are always participating. And because of that, it becomes incredibly important that we have diverse perspectives, including women's perspectives, at all operational levels of conflict that are there, from sort of your on-the-ground engagement up to the big decisions being made about where we actually go fight wars and how we actually fight wars. And so if we think about this, a lot of my research, I think like a lot of people who get involved in this field, because WPS is so based on lived experiences, it's a field that grew out of the fact that traditional academic explanations didn't answer questions that people were living, that people were seeing. So like many people, I came to this from what I experienced. And when we think about the ideas of how WPS and gender played out in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular, the female engagement themes, as Milan mentioned, are kind of the first top of mind thing, right? These were essential groups of women that went out to engage with women in society, because we knew that women in society were early predictors, right? Western women could navigate spaces, even dressed as, soldiers or Marines, that men couldn't. We could, there was a way to engage with the female population as well as the male population in some cases and learn more and provide vital intelligence. And that's a very tactical aspect that we see a lot. However, women's participation from a U.S. perspective, and our allies, I think even more than we looked at this, was vital across operations that weren't just female engagement teams. If we look at attack pilots, for example, so the Cobra is an attack helicopter, and for a long time, strategies and tactics were to fly the helicopter as low and fast as you could. And this made sense for evading the certain types of threats that we thought we were going to have. Well, if you fly low and fast, you're also flying over villages, you're flying over people's homes, you're flying over places where people who really don't have what we think of as a normal stake in the conflict, right? These aren't combatants, these are people who want to go along their daily lives. They weren't part of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or anybody else. But now, when you're flying at night, or during the day for that matter, you're waking up people's kids, you are disrupting day-to-day life. You may not be making insurgents, but you're making people a whole lot friendlier to it. And again, when we talk about women always participate. So when an insurgent comes up to that woman now and says, hey, can we use your house to sabotage the Americans as they come through on their next supply run or their next convoy, she's a whole lot likely to say, oh yes, if we're going to get rid of these people who are keeping my kids up at night, right, that seems like a great idea. Let's yes, whatever we can do to disrupt them. And so bringing a woman's perspective that comes and says, like, hey, maybe like waking up people's kids probably isn't the best way for us to actually show that we're here to try to provide something positive, and changing the way that we actually fly and the tactics, which then reduce the ambushes and the convoy attacks that we were having. So if we think about this isn't just so experiences like this are what led me into really looking at how do we operationalize what it means to bring a gendered perspective and have women actually meaningfully participate. Because one of the pillars when we talk about the implementation plan of the law for the Defense Department is that women need to meaningfully participate across all levels of the Department of Defense. And that really resonated with me, and it's something I have very focused my research on, because so often when I started as a Marine, the expectation was I was going to act like every other Marine, right? So despite the fact that one might have a female body, the expectations are that you act and you think and you engage. I see Milan laughing too. I know this is true in lots of parts of government as you get there, right? That the expectation is that you adopt a particular persona, and that persona is the persona of the institution and how the institution acts and what the very classic and traditional ideas of that institution actually were, right? So if you do that, though, you're undermining meaningful participation. And so a big part of the research and the policy work, when I've sat on the other side of the fence, that I've done is really focus on what does that meaningful mean? How are we providing pathways and policies so that as women, and other sort of typically outgroups participations, but for the purpose of today's discussions, as women are able to gain more opportunities, they're doing it in a way where those lived experiences that have very concrete security outcomes can actually be raised to the forefront and seen as legitimate security concerns, not something that we'll think about after we do, the hard fighting, but something that we know is important to the decisions we make about how we actually conduct conflict.
Thank you. That was really well said and took us through what it's like to be on the front lines, but also strategically what this means in a warfighting effort or in a hearts and minds effort. And of course, that makes us think of Afghanistan. So I'll come back this way. I'll come back to you, Milan, to ask you about Afghanistan. So we've seen this story develop over very, very many years. Talk to us about what the U.S. had learned in terms of women, peace, and security and implemented in Afghanistan, and perhaps how we end up where we are today when it comes to shortfallings of people taking up the WPS agenda.
Well, we've been talking about experience, and my first experience on Afghanistan occurred when I was working in the White House in the Clinton administration. And in the late 90s, when the Taliban were in power, post the horrible civil war with the Mujahideen and everything that created, what we were seeing, the world was seeing, and the United States was certainly seeing, was what was happening to women in Afghanistan. They were in these burqas, they couldn't see, they were isolated in the worst ways. You know, if their ankles were showing, they were flogged. It was a horrible, horrible dehumanization of half the population. And at the same time, you had growing terrorism that was occurring amidst all of this horrible chaos. And then we know what happened in the early Bush administration in terms of going in to really address the fact that the roots of 9/11 were, in many ways, in Afghanistan, and the attack on what al-Qaeda represented. So the getting at the terrorist problem. But from the beginning, even though that was why we went in and to overthrow that reality, the rights of women were very much a part of it. One, it's what people could understand in terms of what was happening in that society. But two, it was an important part of the United States commitment. It wasn't the only reason we were there. That's not how we became engaged in Afghanistan. But it was critical to address that problem because there was no way Afghanistan was ever going to get ahead if it left half of its people behind. And secondly, for that to happen, because we now know, as Sahana said at the outset, that the realities of women's lives, the subjugation, the oppression, creates situations that just further erode security. And one has to pay attention to that. And so investments were made in terms of girls' education, in terms of women's participation more broadly in their society than had been the case. It was a gradual process over 20 years. But by the time we got to where we are today, you had a very strong presence of women's leadership, economically, politically in the parliament, part of what went into that equation. You had education, not just on the elementary level, but the tertiary level. And so it was part and parcel of what we were about. But go forward, and by the time I came back into government, which was in the State Department in the last 6-7 years, when we were intimately engaged in the Women, Peace, and Security framework, and what I always said, women, peace, and security was Afghanistan, was Iraq, was Myanmar today, was Ukraine today, is Ukraine today. It is part of that lens that needs to be projected on everything that we're doing to address those experiences on the ground. But the reality was that while we did invest in development programs mostly, significantly, in terms of really grasping what Afghan women represented, we weren't there. And I struggled so many times with trying to get Afghan women into a donors meeting, trying to have them in a critical meeting where decisions were being made, trying to ensure that the laws they were passing were implemented. It was always more marginal than central. And on one of my first trips to Afghanistan, I remember sitting in a small group of women, and the first one said to me, "Stop looking at us as victims and begin to look at us as the leaders that we are." And I really thought about that because she was exactly right. As I sat around the big mahogany table in the State Department, rarely were women looked at as the agents of change that they could be in trying to create a different Afghanistan, which was what we were trying to do. And whether it was in terms of economic investment and what that represented, or whether it was in terms of their being taken seriously in talks of all kind. Yes, they were put on the Peace Council. Yes, there were some tokens in terms of representation. But it was more marginal than it was central. And I think when the dust settles and we finally go back and analyze all the things that went wrong, one of them will certainly be that we did not fully ensure the meaningful participation of women in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Can I follow very
Jump
quickly?
in.
Because I think there's a very direct tie in conversation here when we talk about this notion of women as victims, women as something that needs to be protected, women as something on the periphery. And there is a bit of a reinforcing mechanism between these negotiations and trying to bring women more centrally, to the actual negotiating table in a meaningful way. And also what we were seeing happening with women inside the DoD in the United States at the same time, where women had been seen as central to these female engagement teams. They had been seen as central to, in Iraq, the Lioness teams that were there. Yet there were still structural barriers for women to actually be seen as sort of the main effort combatants that were there, right? They were this sort of peripheral, and there were all sorts of weird legal wranglings around how long women could spend in a female engagement team, and what sort of, quote unquote, qualification she got afterwards, how that service was viewed, and we looked at promotion boards, and that's again, a whole nother topic of conversation there. But simultaneously, I think it is very interesting when we're talking about implementing these principles, particularly this participation piece of it, and what it means to actually I'll go back to that meaningful participation, right? Not sticking a woman in a room so it looks like we're diverse, right? This is not a, I used to make jokes, and I realize I'm old because my students don't get it anymore when I talk about this shouldn't just look like United Colors of Benetton ad, that was there. But that seems like often what we were trying to do, and we were doing it simultaneously with women in Afghanistan and women who had gone over and fought as part of the U.S. effort there. And a common theme we see as we allow women to participate when they participate in a way that fits the very patriarchal mold of what women should do. Right? Women could participate in female engagement teams because we talk about going and taking your helmet off and having tea and having conversations and talking about being a mother. But then when that clearly has nothing to do with big strategic directions that we need to take. Right? So we've failed to really make that thread go between well, if women are important for this, why aren't they important to be sitting down and talking about what the real issues are? Northern Ireland is one of those key examples where when women were included, a whole host of issues that people hadn't thought about actually got brought to the table and continue to shape a society that's, despite its problems, I think doing better than a lot of our other places we're seeing there, right? So you're having this dual sort of trying to put women in a very specific mold, very specific corner, very specific, this is how a woman should act or what her place is if she's going to act like a woman. And then if we need someone to act like they're part of security, well, you need to uphold this very traditional patriarchal norm, and that's what we expect of you. And if you raise anything else, well, that's not real security. So I think you saw this happening in multiple agencies at multiple times, that women were a big deal when they acted the way that was easy for the West to accept them to act, and it was much harder when they actually said, here's what we want.
It seems that there's also a disconnect between immediate thinking and long-term strategy thinking, and that we also go back to what does it mean to be a strong democracy that is in a place to be able to work with allies and to move towards a more stable, secure, and just world, as opposed to winning engagements in a shorter term period of time or even over a decade, but without that long-term thinking. And I think with Afghanistan, we still need to focus and think about this, although a lot of the world's written that off as intractable at this point, or intractable in terms of helping supporting women's agency, which is clearly very much there. So in that, thinking about women, peace, and security in those long-term strategic tactical ways that our experts know to be vital to national security and to global stability as well. I want to come back to you, Sahana. I know you have thought really deeply about the national security strategy, what it mentions, what it doesn't mention, and the emphasis on strategic competition, and these other very well endorsed aspects of hard security. where do you see the disconnect? Where do you see the opportunity for people to better understand the connection with hard security, whether it's with regards to China, to Russia, to Iran, in the Ukraine today?
Yeah, great question. So I'm also thinking about what Ambassador Revere talked about and Kyle-Ann talked about in terms of meaningful participation. So there's a couple of prongs to my answer to this. So one is wanting to go back to this thought of meaningful participation. Where does it come from? The agenda came from women peace builders who are not able to participate in decision making about what was happening to their own lives, their communities, their countries, right? And what's significant about women peace builders when we're talking about democracy? Those women were leading, organizing social justice groups that advance democratic values, to advance the idea of a free and open society and a secure society for everyone. And I think we also have to, when we ask about strategic blind spots in our security thinking, okay, let's flip the conversation from why should we have women there? This is what women did, et cetera, to why do authoritarian actors target women and minorities? Why is it such a great place to create instability? Let's ask ourselves that. We see it even online with the increase in attacks on female political candidates all over the world when they are consistently targeted and harassed to the extent that those female political candidates withdraw their candidacy. That is a chilling effect on democracy. Why is it that Chinese authority figures actually attack female journalists online when they speak up about their criticisms about the Chinese regime, political regime? Why is it that the CCP Politburo has no women in their leadership at all? So I think we have to think not just why we need to have women there, we need to have women's voices there, but why is it significant that extremist groups also target women? It is obviously a source of power that they're seeing that could be very damaging to their authority and power. So it only makes sense for us to support actors who will always support the sovereignty of a state, will always support institutions that are functioning for everyone in the state to equally participate. So in a strategic sense, yes, we have to look at our economic policies, our understanding of China and Russia's behavior through a gendered lens, which will give us much more comprehensive and nuanced information and understanding about why they're taking the postures they're taking. I mean, we can even look at Ukraine and say, why are women and children and elderly being attacked through sexual violence, right? That is not just a human rights issue, that is a tactic that is destabilizing, not just today for the Ukrainian people, but as they begin to rebuild, as we go to, these are things that Ukrainian women are doing now, is tracking those crimes to why, to take it to an international criminal tribunal, perhaps eventually when we have stabilization, because women's groups and women who are working for social justice and freedom are actually supporting the things that we hold very dear, right? Which is our freedom, an open and free and fair society, the ability to make decisions about our lives and to shape the rules too, right? So that's what a gender perspective brings. And if we don't use that, if we don't take into account these voices, that is a serious blind spot on our part.
Yeah, so we come back to strategic blind spots.
Yeah.
And I can relate to this as co-founder of the Fuller Project, where we are about groundbreaking journalism about women to catalyze positive change. But it is difficult to talk to people who can't imagine a different world. It's difficult to paint why it matters when we haven't yet had a world and we don't yet have examples where women's full participation and agency are centered in strategy. And so there is this question, how much research, how much policy work, how many examples, how many battles in which the outcomes could have been different if this was understood. And I think there is a very strong research foundation going back to Women's Stat, Dr. Hudson and her colleagues, who have, as you mentioned, Sahana, identified that treatment of women is the predictor of stability. It is, both women's status in society, but also freedom from violence. And at what point does a broader policy community, broader than the many allies of this agenda that are out there in other countries and within the US government, but at what point do we reach a tipping point where people actually understand the value of these strategic questions?
Could I just say one thing, which is this question, it could be addressed as having a capability, a military capability to do a gender analysis could actually help the way we think about strategic problems. So for example, we talked about Valerie Hudson's work. There was an earlier study that she did in 2015 called Bare Branches, looking at both China and India's propensity to value a higher male to female sex ratio in their countries. And did that have an impact on the way that that the states behaved, right? And what they found was this higher male to female ratio, which was preferred by governmental policies, et cetera, actually led to a lot of instability and increase in not only domestic violence, but international violence, a propensity for actually a very authoritarian states. That was in 2015. Now, Kyle Ann and Ambassador Verveer have talked about early warning signs. Like, why do we want the meaningful participation? Why do we want to have gender perspectives? That research was done in 2015 on China. That is an early warning sign, right? These state behaviors, if we can actually, we have the ability to track and understand state behavior in advance. As Ambassador Verveer was saying, like, these are we can apply that thinking to our long-term strategic interests and really lead and put our money where our mouth is, basically, right? Really, we have a law, but if we don't fully implement it, if we don't give people the resources or the policy objectives or guidance and leadership that they need to fully implement, then, this is then the US, in my opinion, giving a lot of mixed messages, which lead to failure. Even in the new advance of this idea of integrated deterrence, if we don't commit to the things that we say we're committed to, it's like being a paper tiger.
Santi, can I follow up on that? When Dr. Hudson did her work, and she continues to do really extraordinary work, she basically said that if you really wanted to understand the right security strategy, you can look at either the empowerment of women or the subjugation of women, because in that polarity, you will know what's happening in a country. We at Georgetown, at the Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, put out an index. It's the first ever Women, Peace, and Security Index. And it looks at 3 dimensions of the well-being of women, not just education or political participation, inclusion, critically important, but it also looks at justice, what's happening in terms of discriminating practices that go on that affect women, including the male preference. There are 31 million more males in China than women, which is creating huge tensions. But we also look at security. Are you safe in your home? Are you safe in your community, besides all the war data? And that composite shows absolutely that the state of women, their status, and the status of nations, their well-being, go hand in hand. You cannot ignore that. And when we rank 170 plus countries now in terms of this index, what we find is the countries at the bottom are mired in instability, mired in conflict, oppressive places that subjugate women, whereas those who have, where the conditions, excuse me, of women, excuse me, are more where they need to be, those are much more prosperous, peaceful countries. So this is such a critical point. that we have to look at the status of women and their well-being. And interestingly enough, ironically enough, several years ago, the Department of Defense actually funded a study on fragility, understanding that in fragile situations, the roots of conflict and instability are there, obviously undermining the security of the United States as well. But that fragility is so often based on the condition of women.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to follow on Sahana's comment about the whole idea of a paper tiger, too, that we see this, because it really shows how a lack of really strategically understanding and infusing WPS throughout our whole of government, right? We talk about WPS as a whole of government approach, undermines our own security here. And I think a very recent concrete example, myself and my RAND colleague, Sarah Meadows, put out a early assessment of what the potential national security impact to the Dobbs decision could be. And there's sort of 3 lines that we find in it. One is this notion of how do we actually go out and implement the idea of women's inclusion and women's empowerment when we are regressing on women's rights at home? What sort of message does that send when we have a large NATO focus now on women's empowerment, when we're talking about our allies in the Pacific as us being a alternative to China for that, what sort of message? So we have this broad strategic thinking. But then we also have to think about it in terms of what does it say to women who are potentially looking to join the security sector, that over 40% of them are now going to be stationed in states where they don't have bodily autonomy, where our male counterparts who may have female spouses or children no longer have bodily autonomy, in a midst when we already have a recruiting crisis to bring people in to our national security institutions. It's not just the military. I mean, we're having a recruiting crisis across, again, the whole of government side of it. And then the bigger part of it is, what does it say about the fact that we're mired in such uncertainty? That there's this sense of like, what does it actually mean, right? There's more questions than answers right now, and we're seeing things, play out and fight through the courts. But uncertainty is one of the worst states to be in. When we talk about fragility, when we talk about how women are treated, and we talk about the right to justice, that uncertainty is even often worse than we know it's bad, right? And I think a lot of, Dr. Hudson's work focuses on this, the index focuses on this, this sort of ambiguous state where you don't have consistently applied access to rights or justice throughout a nation state leads to even more potential instability. So I think when we talk about some of these issues of what does it really mean to take a whole of government approach, we have to think about, what are we talking about with regards to reproductive justice, with regards to, security, in your homes as well. We've also seen a increase in femicide as a result of this happening here domestically. And so part of this conversation of it really being whole of government and what it means to security is, how are we using the entirety of our institutions, not just defense and state, which have kind of been seen as being the ones who are responsible for implementing WPS because it's a thing we go do over there, but look at whole of government with WPS being a thing that we have to do here too, to actually be a good ally and partner for both our traditional allies and our emerging partners in the face of strategic competition.
Thank you. That's a great point. We're going to pull it out to our audience and audience questions. For you all viewing, you can join by submitting questions in the Zoom Q&A, also on social media with the hashtag #StrongerWithAllies. So I know from the fantastic team here at Atlantic Council that questions are starting to roll in. I do want to just take a second to say thank you to Atlantic Council, to One Earth Future, to our panelists, our guests here, for this really important conversation with a powerhouse group of panelists. If you need to know about WPS and what actions can move it forward, you are in the right conversation today. We want to hear from you. And again, just so those who are joining midway through, Dr. Kyle Ann Hunter from RAND, Senior Political Scientist, Ambassador Milan Verveer, who joins us as Executive Director of Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, and Sahana Dharmapuri, who joins us, the Executive Director of One Earth, our secure future.
Yes.
All right, so let us hear from some folks who are sending in their questions. Thank you all so much. All right.
Santi, can I
please
just
jump
follow
in.
up 1 second? That what the data shows is that, and this is a huge problem around the world, pervasive violence against women. And it's often marginalized as, what's serious about it? There is a direct correlation, the data shows now, between violence against women and conflict and insecurity.
Well said, thank you. And we know that these are also common sense conclusions. We see autocracy, we see women being suppressed. We see women with agency, and we see more participatory democracy. So again, the research is there. Hearing from the audience. Great question here. Beyond implementing the current agenda, we also need to look at the horizon and adapt the WPS agenda to new challenges. Is the current WPS agenda enough for novel threats such as climate change and emerging technologies? And if not, what would WPS 2.0 look at?
Go ahead.
Oh, well,
Sahana, jump
I'll
in.
just say yes. Well, first of all, women, peace, and security is a broad, the approach applies to any emerging security issue, including climate change, emerging technologies, and whatever else we cannot actually foresee. And I know Georgetown has done a lot of work on climate change. We look a lot at technology. So absolutely, the two things we can just simply in the short time say, using a gender lens on the whole digital ecosystem, not just looking at what's happening with online violence, what's happening at AI, cyber. We have to look at the way our system is being designed. Who is it being designed by? How is it being experienced and used? All those questions go into a gender perspective on technology and using a women, peace, and security lens. But certainly women have been very active in climate change, adaptation, mitigation, et cetera.
Yeah, let me just add to that actually the United Nations has foreseen the need to ensure that the women, peace, and security approach does affect climate. In fact, in one of those strengthening resolutions, climate was included. And it's in many ways a no-brainer because if you look at climate change, it affects everybody, but it disproportionately affects women. But not just that women, again, are victims, but they are problem solvers. And one of my many problems with the National Security Strategy that came out recently is that climate is there in spades, but it's more a focus of the impacts of climate instead of solutions. And of course, gender is not mentioned at all. It is probably the security threat of our time because it's an existential threat that climate change represents. But if you look at what's happening already, look at the Northern Triangle in Central America, look at the Sahel, people cannot eke out an existence anymore agriculturally because the land has dried up. Or they're facing the counter to that, which is massive flooding that destroys their economic viability. What do? They move. Climate refugees is not a proper term because refugees are not defined. There's no definition in the climate environment. But the reality is, with the displacement is coming increased conflict. So you've got a nexus today of climate, gender, and conflict. And we've got to address it. And the way to address it, one way certainly, is the role that women play with their agency in access to renewable, to green technology, to adaptation, to mitigation. And there are countless examples on a level of growing participation with good outcomes, whether it's solar panels, whether it's mini electric grids, whether it's clean cook stoves, economic empowerment, as well as addressing climate change. We've got to spend more time focused on this.
Yeah, and that brings us back to agency and solutions, and thank you for bringing that up. And women and girls empowerment has long been known in the climate movement as an important driver. But today we're also seeing women and girls very, very active in grassroots activism and in solutions. Coming back to our questions from the panel. Male allies, particularly those in leadership positions, can play a large role in advocating for this agenda and being a driving force. What is your advice or what needs to be done to those allies in the audience?
I can jump in real quick because I've been fortunate to have a few very good male allies that have helped me move through. So I think there's two big things that our male allies need to look at. One is that if you are in a position of power, remember that just because something wasn't a problem or a barrier for you doesn't mean it's not a problem or a barrier. And that's one of the biggest things. And I think that goes back to this notion that, to become successful in whatever, industry we're talking about with regards to security, you have to act like everyone who came before you. Well, most of those people who came before you were men, and if I'm going to act just like them, what change am I actually making, right? So number one, I think for men that are in the position to change things, we know that there still are disproportionately a number of men who are in these positions of power. Just center and remember that just because something wasn't a problem for you doesn't mean it's not a real problem, and your job is to fix it for that side. And then number two, I think the biggest thing to think about is be okay being uncomfortable. Recognizing that some of these changes are going to make men, particularly men in positions of power, uncomfortable because they're going to have to use language they maybe don't know. There's going to be concepts that they might be uncomfortable with engaging with. There's going to be ideas of security that are going to challenge those paradigms. So I say be okay, be uncomfortable. Recognize that you're not going to feel great about it every time. You're not going to be the smartest person in the room every time when you're talking about these things. You're going to have to grapple with ideas that are very new, that you may not have grown up with, seen as real security ideas. And just sit with the idea and accept that if you are going to be an ally is an action verb, right? Like to be an ally is to do something, right? To be in an alliance, not to just say, oh, that's very nice, I support you, right? But to actually go out and do. And doing's hard. It's hard to stand up for people who are different. It's hard to learn new things. So realize that there are things that are barriers for others that weren't for you, and do something about it. And be okay being uncomfortable. Know that that is part of the journey. And I'll tell that every woman who's been in these positions that have risen up, we've all been very uncomfortable our entire career. So come welcome. We'll tell you all about being uncomfortable. But those are my two pieces of advice.
Thank you. That's a great piece of advice. I'm gonna run through. And Dr. Hunter, you also talked about, we're talking about women, and we're talking about all groups of people who are not fitting the status quo or the dominant culture in an organization, whether that has to do with race or whether it has to do with class or sexual identity or gender identity or other factors. And as we're talking about inclusion of one group, we're talking about inclusion of all groups, the best ideas, the best talent, and ultimately the best strategies for the U.S. and globally. Can I have your piece of advice and your last word?
I just think one of the reasons we've not done as well as we need to do on implementation is because we don't have buy-in for the most part from the top. Mm-hmm. You've got wonderful people across government in civilian and military capacities, but they are working in their small area, albeit important, and it has not risen to the top. The reason we were able to do as much as we did, for example, in the State Department, putting out the first administration-wide national action plan on women, peace, and security, because we had a secretary, Secretary Clinton at the time, who really understood this issue and worked at it and sent the message across the department. But that is not the case in most instances. And without that top buy-in, which is mostly male still, you're not going to have the kinds of outcomes we really need to see. So male allies are all important. There's increased research on how men benefit from gender equality. And a lot of this is self-interest. I always feel that the best appeal is self-interest. What does it do for me? It makes you more effective in what you do. And if you can see the benefits of it across policy areas that make this difference, you're going to be more engaged than you might be otherwise. So we really do need greater male participation.
Thank you. And last word to you, Sahana, on this or another theme.
Well, I completely agree with the political will. We need that. I think male allies, if we can get senior level leaders trained in using a gender perspective to look at security problems differently, that would be great. And maybe two concrete things. One is, would love to see senior male leaders in this administration and political cycle pass or confirm a GWE ambassador for us. That's very important. And I also would like to see in the upcoming 2023 Women, Peace, and Security Strategy strong links back to the NDS, the NSS, so that that can actually create some coherence in our policymaking. And I think senior level male allies are very important in that endeavor, both of those endeavors. Yeah.
Thank you. These are clear central policy formalization aspects that can be done. I'm Xanthi Sharf from the Fuller Project. Thank you to our host for having me as your moderator, and thank you for this conversation, Sahana Dharmapuri, Ambassador Milan Verveer, Dr. Kylan Hunter. I hope the audience has taken away both information and actions.